Homeless veteran accused of trespassing shocks everyone when he's called to court. Ever wonder how a single accusation can turn an entire city upside down? Meet David Marshall, a once decorated war hero who ended up living under a bridge in the very community he served to protect. When David is accused of trespassing on a property owned by a powerful real estate mogul, no one expects the shocking turn of events that will unfold. This is a story of hidden truths, buried betrayals, and dramatic twists that will test the limits of justice and compassion. Prepare to witness how a single court summons exposes the secrets of an entire town and changes countless lives forever. David Marshall had never imagined his life would unravel to this point. On a chilly November evening, he squatted beneath the old Willow Creek Bridge, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothes he'd collected from various charities. The drone of passing cars overhead felt strangely comforting, a constant reminder that the world was still moving, even if he sometimes felt frozen in place. Years ago, David had worn his country's uniform, proudly serving in the USARMY. He had been stationed in Afghanistan, where he'd earned commendations for bravery under fire. When he returned stateside, however, the transition to civilian life was far from seamless. An uneasy job market, lingering injuries, and a series of personal losses chipped away at his sense of stability. Before he knew it, the rocky road of post-discharge life had left him homeless. It had all started with a layoff at the steel factory that once promised a good pension and steady work. When the plant shut down, David found himself competing against thousands of other unemployed workers. Despite his discipline and skills, he couldn't land a stable position. His sister, who had been his pillar of support, died suddenly in a car crash, leaving him with no close family. And so, piece by piece, the life he'd worked so hard to rebuild slipped through his fingers. Determined to maintain some dignity, David discovered the Willow Creek Bridge provided shelter from the harsh winter winds. It was barely enough to keep him alive, but he tried to make it feel like home, if such a term could even be applied to his circumstances. With resourceful ingenuity, he set up a small camp using discarded tarps and crates. A battered old sleeping bag, donated by a church, was his most prized possession. It kept him somewhat insulated on nights when temperatures dipped far below freezing. The local community in Glendale, an unassuming town an hour outside Chicago, knew there were homeless people around. But few paid close attention. David wasn't the only one sleeping rough, but he was among the most visible whenever he ventured to collect cans or ask for spare change. Occasionally, a local volunteer group would pass by with a food truck, distributing soup and sandwiches to the homeless encampments. David was always first to thank them, to show some semblance of gratitude, but Glendale was changing. In the past decade, new businesses and high-end residences had cropped up. The city's old charm was being replaced by sleek modernity, and behind that transformation was a well-known real estate magnate named Roger Kincaid. Kincaid's name was emblazoned on half the construction projects around town. Rumor had it that he had deep connections in both local and state politics. If there was a new business to be opened, Kincaid likely had a hand in it, or at least an eye on its profits. From his perch under the bridge, David watched as bulldozers cleared nearby land. Over time, sections of the creek were rerouted to accommodate Kincaid's next luxury condo development. It was more than just an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to the homeless community that had formed around the bridge. Rumors circulated that the property was privately owned by one of Kincaid's many shell companies. And if you were caught there, you could expect swift removal or worse. One evening, as David rummaged through a dumpster behind a local diner, two men approached him. Both wore well-tailored suits, completely out of place in the dimly lit alley. One was short and thick around the waist, sporting a gold watch that glinted under the street lamp. The other was tall and thin, with sharp, angular features that gave him a predatory look. "You're David Marshall, aren't you?" the tall man asked, raising his brow. He kept his voice dangerously calm. David stiffened. He was used to being overlooked, invisible. To hear his name, spoken in such a calculating tone, filled him with dread. "Yeah," he managed, stepping back. "You know you're not supposed to be on Kincaid's property," the short man said, glancing pointedly at the dumpster. "He's the property owner, including this alleyway and the bridge. You're trespassing, buddy." David felt his cheeks burn. "I was just looking for something to eat." "And that's the problem," the tall man interrupted, producing what looked like a legal document. "We've warned you people before. Mr. Kincaid doesn't want you here. You're an eyesore, driving down property values." The short man smirked. "We're here to give you this." He shoved the paper into David's chest. "Your court summons for trespassing." David could only stare at the paper in disbelief. The words swam in front of his eyes. State of Illinois versus David Marshall. He felt the weight of the world pressed down on him in that moment. "We'll see you in court," the tall man said with a sneer, turning on his heel. As they walked away, the short man called over his shoulder, "Good luck finding a lawyer." David stood in the alley, breath turning to white puffs in the cold night air, clutching the summons. He'd thought things couldn't get worse. Little did he know, this court date would be just the beginning of a storm he never saw coming. The morning after receiving the summons, David awoke under the bridge with a throbbing headache. Sleep had been elusive. He replayed the previous night's confrontation in his mind until the first rays of sunlight forced him to stir. He sat up slowly, his breath misting in the icy morning air. He clutched the legal papers tightly, their edges creased from being gripped all night. The summons didn't just accuse him of trespassing, it threatened legal penalties, including hefty fines he had no means of paying, and even potential jail time. The very thought of jail made his stomach churn. He'd faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, but the idea of being locked away felt like another war altogether, one he hadn't signed up for. After a silent breakfast of stale bread and a half-empty bottle of water, David decided he had to seek help. A fleeting memory crossed his mind. He recalled reading about Disabled American Veterans DAV, a real non-profit organization that sometimes provided legal aid to veterans. If anyone could help him, maybe it was them, but Glendale was small, and the nearest DAV office was in Chicago. Getting there would require a bus ride he couldn't afford. Undeterred, David gathered his scant belongings, a few shirts, a worn jacket, and 2 battered boots that had served him since his days in the army. Tucking the court summons into his jacket pocket, he trudged 3 miles to the Glendale Community Center. On Thursday mornings, a local pastor offered free coffee and sometimes had bus passes for those in dire need. The community center buzzed with activity. Young children were running around in circles, while volunteers stacked canned goods for distribution. A line of people waited for hot meals, their faces lined with the same fatigue David felt in his bones. Feeling slightly out of place, he searched for the pastor, a kind-hearted man named Father Rodriguez. "David?" Father Rodriguez's warm baritone voice called out when he spotted the veteran across the hall. "Come sit. Have some coffee." David nodded gratefully, his shoulders slumping with relief at the sight of a friendly face. He took a seat at a folding table where the pastor joined him, offering a steaming paper cup. The coffee smelled like salvation. "You look troubled," the pastor noted, concern etched on his face. "What's going on?" Without ceremony, David slid the summons across the table. The pastor's eyes widened as he read it. "Trespassing on Kincaid property," he muttered under his breath. "It's getting worse. I heard they're targeting homeless individuals living under the Willow Creek Bridge." David explained the encounter with the 2 men in suits. I don't know what to do, he admitted, desperation leaking into his voice. I'm a veteran. I served my country. Now I can't even find a place to sleep without being charged like a criminal. The pastor placed a comforting hand on David's shoulder. This is unjust, he said firmly. We'll figure something out. I can help you with a bus pass to Chicago if that's what you need. David's eyes lit up. Thank you, Father. I'm hoping the DAV can help me with legal representation. That's a good plan, the pastor replied, but be cautious. I've heard rumors Kincaid's influence goes far. He's got connections, lawyers, judges, politicians. If this is going to court, you'll need every bit of assistance. With a tremor in his voice, David asked, why is he doing this? Doesn't he have enough money and land? Why target me and a few others under a bridge? The pastor sighed. Land development, property values, prestige. People like Kincaid always want more. They view everything people included in terms of profit or loss. Your presence, your very existence, is inconvenient to him. David felt anger rise, hot and sharp in his chest. He thought of his time in service, the dust and heat of foreign lands, risking his life for freedoms he now struggled to enjoy. But that anger quickly dissolved into a hollow pit of helplessness. He needed more than righteous indignation. He needed a plan. Father Rodriguez finished his coffee and stood. I'll get you that bus pass, David. In the meantime, stay safe. You'll receive a court date soon, and you don't want to miss it. Grateful tears pricked at David's eyes as he accepted a small envelope containing the bus pass and some spare change. Thank you, he whispered, voice trembling. I won't forget this. Godspeed, the pastor replied. Keep faith. There are good people out there who will stand by you. David took one last look around the community center, taking heart from the sense of warmth and community. His hope, while fragile, was alive. Clutching his meager belongings and the bus pass, he set out, determined to find legal help before Kincaid's power could fully engulf him in an unjust system. As he exited the building, a fierce wind whipped through the streets, blowing dust and leaves in spirals. It felt like nature itself was a reminder. A storm was coming, and David would have to summon every ounce of courage to weather it. It took David nearly 2 hours by bus to reach Chicago's bustling downtown. The DAV office was housed in an unremarkable brick building on West Randolph Street, only a few blocks from the famed Chicago Theater. The sharp winter air stung his face as he walked toward the tall glass doors. He swallowed hard, anxiety knotting his stomach. Even though he was a veteran, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was intruding. Yet, desperation propelled him forward. Inside, a receptionist with kind eyes greeted him. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. David introduced himself quietly, explaining his situation in as few words as possible: homeless, accused of trespassing, and in need of legal support. She nodded compassionately and handed him a clipboard with some paperwork. As he filled out the forms, he noticed a few other veterans in the waiting area. Some were in wheelchairs, others had visible injuries, while many more carried invisible burdens. It was a stark reminder that he wasn't alone in his struggles. After a short wait, he was introduced to a legal advisor named Amanda Rivers. She was a petite woman with a determined expression, her hair pulled into a tight bun. Her handshake was firm, her gaze unwavering. "David, nice to meet you," she said, motioning for him to sit in an office stacked with file boxes. "I've read your initial report. This is quite a situation." David took a seat, fidgeting with the court summons. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "I have no money for a lawyer. And from what I've heard, this Kincaid guy is powerful." Amanda nodded, her expression grim. "Roger Kincaid's reputation precedes him. He's got a team of top-tier lawyers on retainer. But let's not panic. We've handled similar cases, though usually not as high profile. It's worth noting you have rights, and the legal system doesn't automatically bend to someone just because they're wealthy." David exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "So you'll take my case?" Amanda leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "I'll see what resources we can allocate. The DAV often partners with pro bono lawyers who handle cases involving veterans' rights. However, we need to move quickly. Do you have a specific court date yet?" "Not yet," David said, shaking his head, "but they served me with this summons." He slid the papers toward her. She skimmed the documents, occasionally pausing to jot down notes. "They're accusing you of knowingly trespassing on private property, along with some vague charges about loitering and public nuisance. They're piling on charges to pressure a guilty plea, most likely." David's heart sank. "But I didn't harm anyone or damage anything. I was just living. We'll build a case around that. We'll argue that your presence under the bridge was out of necessity. The city has failed to provide adequate shelter, and you, as a veteran, should not be penalized for homelessness, especially if the property lines weren't clearly posted. We can leverage your military record too. It shows good character." He nodded, relief mixing with apprehension. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." Amanda cracked a small smile. "Don't worry about that right now. The best thanks you can give is to hang in there. I'll try to get you a meeting with a pro bono attorney who specializes in housing disputes. Meanwhile, the first need any documents you have related to your service discharge papers, medical forms, anything that might help." David patted his coat pocket. "I have some ID and my VA card. My discharge papers might be in a storage unit, but I lost access because I couldn't pay. Everything else, it's gone." Amanda's expression softened. "We'll make do. Let's get copies of your ID and VA card. Also, try contacting the storage facility. Sometimes they grant access for urgent legal matters. We'll need to build as strong a defense as possible." Before they parted ways, Amanda handed David a small index card. "My direct number. Call me if anything changes, or if Kincaid's people approach you again." David tucked the card safely into his pocket. "Thank you, Amanda. You don't know how much this means." She stood up and extended her hand. "We'll do our best, David. You fought for this country. It's time the country fought for you." Stepping back out onto West Randolph Street, David felt a renewed sense of hope. He wasn't naive. He knew the battle ahead was daunting, but at least he wasn't fighting it alone. He had an ally, maybe even several if the DAV could connect him to the right resources. For the first time in weeks, a small flame of optimism flickered in his heart. Still, as he walked toward the bus stop, the towering skyscrapers seemed to loom overhead like silent judges. In a city so big, it was easy for someone like him to fall through the cracks. Would the justice system see him as a person worthy of help, or just another statistic? Clutching the bus pass, he boarded for the long ride back to Glendale, determined to hold on to that fragile hope for as long as he could. News of David's summons spread slowly at first, shared in hushed tones among the local homeless community and whispered by volunteers at the community center. However, it wasn't long before a local reporter for the Glendale Gazette, a small but respected weekly paper, caught wind of the story. Her name was Sarah Meyer, a tenacious journalist known for her investigative pieces on local politics. She had heard rumors that Kincaid's development projects frequently led to forced evictions, albeit quietly. When she got a tip about a homeless veteran being charged with trespassing by none other than Roger Kincaid, her instincts told her there was a bigger story lurking beneath the surface. Sarah found David near the Glendale Community Center, lining up for a free meal. He hesitated when she introduced herself, worried her coverage might do more harm than good. But as she explained her intentions to shed light on how big developers misuse the law to target the vulnerable, David felt his reservations ease. "I don't want to be a spectacle," he admitted, standing off to the side so as not to disturb others in the meal line. "I just need justice." Sarah nodded, empathy shining in her eyes. Sometimes shining a light on injustice is the only way to fight it. Let me tell your story. No spin, no hidden agenda. David hesitated, then sighed. All right, let's do it. They sat on a nearby bench, the cold wind biting at their faces as Sarah turned on her voice recorder. She asked David about his military service, how he became homeless, and the events leading up to the trespassing charge. He spoke candidly, though his voice trembled with both the chill and lingering vulnerability. She took notes, asked clarifying questions, and promised to vet any information about Kincaid. By the time they finished, David felt a mixture of relief and fear. He'd just handed over personal details of his life to a stranger in the hope that the community would rally to his side. It was a gamble. True to her word, Sarah got to work. The Glendale Gazette ran the story under a front-page headline the following week: "Homeless veteran charged with trespassing by local tycoon." The article detailed David's service record and how he ended up under Willow Creek Bridge. It also posed hard questions about Kincaid's tactics, challenging whether legal might was being used to bully the defenseless. Reactions came swiftly. Readers wrote letters to the editor, some outraged that a veteran could be treated so callously. Others defended Kincaid, claiming property rights must be protected. The story sparked discussions on social media, where David's plight was shared hundreds of times. In an interesting turn, city officials began receiving phone calls from concerned citizens. The mayor's office was flooded with emails urging him to intervene. The Glendale Gazette's website saw a surge in traffic, and national outlets like the Chicago Tribune briefly mentioned the situation in their local roundup, citing the Gazette's reporting. Kincaid's team did not remain idle. Within days, Roger Kincaid himself appeared on a local radio show to address the issue. His voice was smooth and polished as he explained that he had sympathy for our veterans, but claimed safety and liability issues left him with no choice but to press charges for trespassing. Behind the scenes, Amanda Rivers at DAV was thrilled by the coverage. She knew that public sentiment could be a powerful lever in a case like David's. If enough people showed outrage, a judge might think twice before doling out a harsh sentence to a homeless veteran. The more attention the case received, the harder it would be for Kincaid to manipulate the system quietly. David, meanwhile, felt a sense of unease. Publicity brought support, yes, but it also magnified scrutiny. He found himself the reluctant figurehead of a larger struggle, the battle for homeless rights versus the interests of wealthy developers. Strangers approached him with words of encouragement, while others hurled insults or told him to get a job. He tried to focus on the supportive voices, but the backlash stung. One evening, as David settled under the bridge, he noticed new signs warning trespassers about prosecution. Tension buzzed in the air. Other homeless folks eyed him warily. Some feared the newfound publicity would bring more police raids. The city had already cleared another camp near the old train tracks. Now, it felt like only a matter of time before the bulldozers arrived at Willow Creek. In the midst of all this, David received a call from Amanda with surprising news. A seasoned pro bono lawyer named Mark Delaney had agreed to represent him. Delaney had built a reputation fighting for underdogs, from migrant workers to renters facing unlawful evictions. If anyone was willing to stand up to Kincaid's heavy-handed legal team, it was Mark Delaney. The next day, David met Delaney in a cramped back office at the Glendale Community Center. The lawyer was in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and a quick, assured manner. "I've read the case file," Delaney said, skipping small talk. "I don't like bullies, and Kincaid sounds like a grade A bully." David nodded, allowing a flicker of a smile. "Thank you for taking this on." Delaney's gaze hardened with resolve. "We're going to fight this, David, and we're going to make sure this never happens to another veteran or anyone else again." For the first time in a long while, David felt more than hope. He felt a sense of righteous indignation shared by others who believed in his cause. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. Maybe justice wasn't just a lofty notion, but something tangible and within reach. Days turned into a blur as David and his new legal team prepared for the upcoming court hearing. The Glendale Courthouse was a modest stone building that looked more like a repurposed library than a center of legal proceedings. Yet, the tension it housed was very real. Mark Delaney, despite his packed schedule of pro bono cases, dedicated several hours each week to strategize David's defense. He reviewed city ordinances, scoured property records, and even took the time to visit Willow Creek Bridge to see the site of the alleged trespassing. Delaney clicked pictures of rusted, no trespassing signs that were barely visible and, in some spots, missing altogether. Meanwhile, Amanda Rivers from DAV coordinated witness statements from other homeless individuals who had been pushed off Kincaid properties. A few were initially reluctant to speak up, fearing retaliation from Kincaid's men, but Amanda gently reassured them. Their testimonies could demonstrate a pattern, Kincaid systematically using the law to displace homeless communities. Every day, David felt the pressure mounting. The public interest in his case had grown, thanks in large part to Sarah Meyer's article in the Glendale Gazette. But that also meant more prying eyes. Sometimes, local news vans would park outside the courthouse or near the bridge. David grew anxious under the spotlight, still struggling to reconcile how his personal misfortune became a public cause célèbre. It was a cold, drizzling afternoon when David finally got the official court date, January 15th, just 3 weeks away. The notice arrived in an envelope bearing the county seal. David tore it open with trembling hands, dread pooling in his stomach. The hearing would determine whether the trespassing charges stood and if he'd face fines or even jail time. He immediately called Amanda, who responded with calm reassurance. "We'll be ready," she promised. "Delaney is building a strong defense. Don't lose hope." Yet hope was a fragile thing for David. Each night, under the bridge, he would curl up in his worn sleeping bag and wonder if he could endure more setbacks. Memories of Afghanistan sometimes flooded his dreams. He'd see the faces of fellow soldiers, hear the echoes of explosions. In those dreams, he was once again a man with a mission, a sense of purpose. In the waking world, he felt more like a pawn in a game orchestrated by the powerful. The days leading up to the court date also brought a surprising surge of public support. A local church organized a small fundraiser to help David with living expenses during the trial. The Glendale Gazette started a petition urging the mayor to pass more compassionate legislation for the homeless. Even social media campaigns popped up, with hashtags like #StandWithDavid trending in local circles. On the flip side, Kincaid's camp wasn't idle. Rumors spread that he had hired a private investigator to dig into David's past, hoping to find dirt that could discredit him. Some online trolls claimed David was faking his veteran status, or that he was dishonorably discharged. David tried not to read the comments, but sometimes they found their way to him, fueling his doubts. One evening, as David was leaving the community center after meeting with Delaney, he spotted a hulking figure leaning against a sleek black SUV in the parking lot. The man wore a leather jacket and had a menacing aura that made David's skin prickle. As David walked by, the man gave a slow, mocking clap. "Court date's coming up," the man drawled. "Better be careful what you say in there." David's fists tightened. He recognized intimidation when he saw it, but he was determined not to be bullied. Without replying, he hurried toward the bus stop, heart pounding. He reported the incident to Delaney, who advised him to stay in public spaces and keep a phone charged at all times for emergencies. The next day, Sarah Meyer published an update. Homeless veterans court date. Announced witnesses claim intimidation tactics by Kincaid's associates. While David appreciated that the truth was coming to light, the escalation made him uneasy. He didn't want anyone else getting hurt because of his case. Finally, the week of January 15th arrived. The night before the hearing, David sat under the bridge, gazing at the reflection of the city lights in the creek. He clutched an old photograph of his army squad, the corners tattered from constant handling. He thought of their bravery, their camaraderie in the face of overwhelming odds. A tear slipped down his cheek, and he whispered into the cold air, "Please, let justice prevail. Let my story mean something." He had no idea just how significant the following day would be, not just for him, but for everyone involved, and for the entire town of Glendale. The morning of January 15th broke cold and clear, a stark backdrop for the day that could redefine David's life. He arrived at the Glendale courthouse with Mark Delaney by his side, both men quiet and focused. Amanda Rivers was there too, carrying a folder of evidence and statements, her expression resolute. A small crowd had gathered, local reporters and curious onlookers jostling for a view of the man whose story had become a symbol of injustice. In the courtroom's wooden pews, David caught sight of Sarah Meyer, notebook in hand, and Father Rodriguez, who offered a reassuring nod. The front row on the opposite side of the aisle was occupied by Roger Kincaid and his legal entourage, each impeccably dressed in tailored suits. Kincaid himself sat with a confident air, exuding a veneer of calm superiority. When the judge, a stern-looking woman named Judge Alicia Romero, entered, everyone rose. She wasted no time, calling the case with a brisk efficiency. State of Illinois versus David Marshall on charges of trespassing and loitering on private property. Delaney stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, Mark Delaney for the defense. We're entering a plea of not guilty." The lead prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Gerald Farnsworth, responded, "The prosecution is prepared to demonstrate that Mr. Marshall willfully ignored posted signs and engaged in repeated trespassing, thereby violating the property rights of Mr. Roger Kincaid." Judge Romero adjusted her glasses. "Very well, let's hear opening arguments." Farnsworth began, painting David as a chronic trespasser who had been repeatedly warned. He referenced the growing homeless population, insinuating it was a detriment to public safety and property values. His words were polished, but carried a chilly dismissal of David's humanity. When Delaney took the floor, he spoke with quiet conviction. "My client is a United States Army veteran who has fallen on hard times." The so-called posted signs on the property were either missing or barely legible. Mr. Marshall posed no threat or damage to the property. He simply sought shelter. "We intend to show that the real crime here is the misuse of the judicial system to punish homelessness, a condition exacerbated by economic hardship and a lack of social support." The trial proceeded with witness testimonies. A few of David's homeless acquaintances described how Kincaid's men harassed them. An urban planner testified about the unclear boundaries along Willow Creek, explaining how frequent construction had blurred the lines between public and private land. Yet Farnsworth tried to poke holes, insinuating that if it wasn't clearly public property, David had no right to be there. David's heart hammered in his chest when the judge asked him to take the stand. He glanced at Delaney, who gave an encouraging nod. Once sworn in, David recounted his military service, the injuries he sustained, his fruitless job search, and the tragic losses that left him alone. His voice caught when he described the night he received the summons, but he steadied himself, determined to speak truth. As he finished, Farnsworth stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Marshall, you claim you didn't see any no trespassing signs?" They were worn down, barely visible, David replied calmly. So you admit there were signs, but you just chose not to see them, Farnsworth prodded. A flicker of anger crossed David's face. That's not what I said. I'm saying if you drove by at 50 miles an hour, you might spot them. But under that bridge, there was nothing indicating it was Kincaid's property. Farnsworth pressed on with more pointed questions, but David held his ground. When he finally stepped down from the stand, relief washed over him. He hadn't broken under the prosecutor's pressure. Then came the moment everyone anticipated. Roger Kincaid was called to testify. He rose with measured dignity, stepping to the witness stand. His posture was impeccable, his demeanor calm. Farnsworth guided him gently at first. Mr. Kincaid, can you explain your involvement with the Willow Creek development? Certainly, Kincaid said. I own the land around the bridge, purchased legally, and with the intention to develop it into a residential complex that would benefit the community. Were there signs posted indicating it was private property? Yes, Kincaid asserted confidently. I've seen them myself, multiple times. Delaney stood for cross-examination, cutting to the heart of the matter. Mr. Kincaid, you said you purchased that land. Could you provide the court with the deed and records of sale? Kincaid smiled, as though asked a trivial question. My legal team has those documents on file. It's a matter of public record. Delaney's gaze never wavered. Your Honor, we've reviewed the county records extensively. The land was initially categorized as part of a public easement for flood control, which complicates claims of private ownership. We're still waiting for the prosecution or Mr. Kincaid's team to produce incontrovertible proof of purchase, specifically the lot with the bridge. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Kincaid visibly stiffened. I assure you everything is in order. That's interesting, Delaney replied. Coolly, because the Glendale County Clerk's office has no record of a direct sale to Mr. Kincaid or any of his known business entities regarding the exact parcel under Willow Creek Bridge. Judge Romero frowned, looking at Farnsworth. Mr. Farnsworth, the court requires clear documentation of the property in question. Farnsworth cleared his throat. We, have requested those documents from Mr. Kincaid's legal team. They should be arriving shortly. Delaney seized the moment, scanning the courtroom. Your Honor, without clear proof that this land is indeed private, let alone owned by Kincaid, the entire trespassing charge is questionable at best. Kincaid's face reddened. He gripped the edge of the witness stand. Don't be ridiculous. I've invested millions into that development. The judge banged her gavel lightly. Mr. Kincaid, please maintain composure. At that point, a hushed gasp came from the back of the courtroom. A paralegal from Delaney's team approached with a file. She handed it to Delaney, who raised an eyebrow as he skimmed the contents. What is it? Judge Romero asked, impatient. Delaney cleared his throat. Your Honor, it appears that part of the land Kincaid claims is his was never legally transferred. The original owners, an elderly couple who died with no children, had left the property to the city decades ago, specifically to be used as a public space, though no official records were updated to reflect that. In short, it's not Mr. Kincaid's land to develop. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Kincaid looked like he'd been struck. Farnsworth stammered, rifling through his papers. The tension was palpable. Judge Romero looked squarely at Kincaid. Can you provide any refutation to this new evidence? Kincaid sputtered. My lawyers. They assured me. This must be some administrative mix-up, Delaney continued, his tone sharp. It would seem, Mr. Kincaid, that you've been building on and policing property that might actually belong to the city, which means you had no right to file trespassing charges against anyone, let alone Mr. Marshall. The gallery erupted with whispers and gasps. David's mind reeled. He glanced at Amanda, who was grinning ear to ear, and at Sarah Meyer, who looked like she'd just witnessed the scoop of the century. Order, Judge Romero demanded, banging her gavel again. She turned to Farnsworth. Given this development, the prosecution may wish to reconsider the trespassing charge. We will recess for an hour while both sides review the documents. As the courtroom emptied, David felt lightheaded, as though gravity had momentarily released him. Had Kincaid been bluffing about his ownership, or had he knowingly manipulated the system, thinking no one would bother to check the details? Either way, this new twist changed everything. In the hallway, Delaney placed a hand on David's shoulder. We've just uncovered a major flaw in their case. This could be the turning point. David could barely form the words. I thank you. I never knew. I never thought. Delaney nodded confidently. We're not done yet. But it looks like Kincaid's arrogance might be his undoing. When the court resumed after the brief recess, everyone sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Roger Kincaid's previously unshakable confidence had evaporated, replaced by a tense, defensive posture. His lawyers scrambled to buy time, attempting to dismiss the new documents as incomplete and misinterpreted. But Mark Delaney methodically tore through their claims, presenting city surveys from decades past, statements from neighbors who'd lived in Glendale all their lives, and an affidavit from the local historical society. All pointed to the same conclusion. The land under Willow Creek Bridge was, at worst, a disputed public easement. Kincaid's claim of full private ownership was shaky at best and possibly fraudulent at worst. Judge Alicia Romero leaned back in her chair, hands folded sternly. I'm giving the prosecution and Mr. Kincaid's legal team until the end of the week to produce any legitimate deeds or sale documents. If none are forthcoming, I will be forced to dismiss these charges. Gerald Farnsworth, the prosecutor, cleared his throat. Your Honor, we request additional time to thoroughly review. Request denied, Judge Romero replied sharply. You've had ample opportunity to provide these documents. This case has been ongoing for weeks. If Mr. Kincaid indeed owns the land, he should be able to prove it. Kincaid slumped, making no attempt to hide his frustration. The judge quickly scheduled a final hearing for Friday, giving the prosecution a mere 4 days to salvage their case. For David, walking out of the courtroom felt like emerging from a dark tunnel into sudden brightness. The possibility that the charges could be thrown out glimmered before him, a beacon of hope. But the revelations went beyond his personal case. They hinted at a much larger scandal. If Kincaid had built or planned developments on land he didn't properly own, the implications would ripple across Glendale. In the following days, the local media erupted with speculation. Sarah Meyer wrote a hard-hitting follow-up article in the Glendale Gazette titled Cracks in Kincaid's Empire. She interviewed city officials who'd issued permits to Kincaid's companies. One official admitted, off the record, that Kincaid's attorneys often rushed permits through channels without proper oversight, a testament to the developer's strong political connections. It looked increasingly like Kincaid had bet on no one digging too deeply into his affairs. As the story gained traction, more people stepped forward. Former employees claimed they were forced to forge or backdate documents under Kincaid's orders. Residents near Willow Creek came forward with old property maps that contradicted Kincaid's boundary lines. Public outrage soared, fueled by the idea that a wealthy businessman had been using questionable methods to expand his empire while simultaneously persecuting a homeless veteran. Kincaid tried to do damage control, releasing statements asserting he was an innocent businessman who simply followed the advice of his legal consultants. But each new revelation chipped away at his credibility. Social media campaigns that had once been small, local efforts ballooned. Hashtags like #KincaidExposed and #JusticeForDavid trended in neighboring regions. National outlets began to pick up the story, intrigued by the David versus Goliath narrative, quite literally David. In this case, against a modern-day titan of real estate. Meanwhile, David and his allies worked tirelessly. Amanda Rivers coordinated with local non-profits to highlight the broader issue of homelessness. Mark Delaney prepared for Friday's hearing, ready to slam the final nail in the coffin of the trespassing charge. Tension simmered in Glendale's corridors of power. Whispers abounded that the mayor was distancing himself from Kincaid, fearing political fallout. On Thursday evening, just one day before the final hearing, Delaney received a phone call. It was from an anonymous tipster who claimed to have crucial documents related to the Willow Creek land deal. Delaney arranged a clandestine meeting in a parking garage on the outskirts of town. David joined him, partly out of curiosity and partly for security. Neither of them knew what to expect. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, a woman in a hooded jacket approached, gripping a manila envelope. "I used to work for Kincaid," she whispered, glancing nervously around. "I can't stay silent anymore." Delaney looked inside the envelope, his eyes widening as he surveyed copies of emails and letters. They outlined how Kincaid's team manipulated deed transfers and coerced local officials to sign off on developments. It was a damning paper trail that could shift more than just David's fate. It might tear down the entire foundation of Kincaid's business empire. "Thank you," Delaney said, softly. "This could be the breakthrough we need." The woman nodded and disappeared into the night. David's heart pounded as he realized the magnitude of what they'd just received. If Kincaid had indeed falsified documents, this went beyond civil liability. It bordered on criminal territory. Back at the community center, Delaney and Amanda pored over the documents until the early hours of the morning. Each new page seemed more incriminating than the last. They would present the evidence to the judge on Friday. If all went well, Kincaid's case would collapse entirely, and David would be free from the looming threat of jail. Yet a nagging worry tugged at David's mind. Powerful men didn't fall gracefully. Kincaid wouldn't go down without a fight, and if he felt cornered, there was no telling how far he might go to protect his interests. David recalled the menacing figure from the SUV, the intimidations, and the online trolls. He wondered if exposing the truth might put him and those helping him in danger. Despite the risk, David couldn't turn back. He needed justice, not just for himself, but for anyone else Kincaid had trampled. Tomorrow's hearing promised to be dramatic. As David tried to catch a few hours of sleep, he prayed this gamble would pay off. They had come too far, uncovered too many secrets. There was no choice but to see it through to the end. Friday morning dawned with a leaden sky, reflecting the gravity of the day's proceedings. By the time David, Delaney, and Amanda arrived at the courthouse, they could barely move through the throng of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones angled toward them, and anxious voices clamored for quotes. It seemed like all of Glendale and possibly half of Chicago had turned its gaze onto this pivotal hearing. Inside, the tension was palpable. Kincaid and his legal team occupied one side of the aisle, their faces grim. The prosecution appeared equally uneasy. Judge Alicia Romero wasted no time, calling the courtroom to order. "Prosecution, do you have the necessary documents to prove Mr. Kincaid's legal ownership of the Willow Creek Bridge property?" she asked, looking directly at Farnsworth. Farnsworth cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we regret to inform the court that we have not received conclusive proof. We respectfully request a dismissal without prejudice so we may—" "Let's not jump ahead," Delaney interjected, stepping forward. "We have new evidence that calls into question not only Mr. Kincaid's ownership, but also his honesty in these proceedings." He held up the manila envelope. "These are emails and notarized documents suggesting that Kincaid's team engaged in fraudulent practices to claim land they do not rightfully own." A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge signaled for Delaney to approach. After reviewing the contents, Judge Romero looked visibly disturbed. She fixed her gaze on Kincaid. "Mr. Kincaid, do you have an explanation for these documents?" Kincaid's complexion turned ashen. I'm not aware of any fraudulent activities. This must be a misunderstanding," he stammered. Delaney pressed on. "Additionally, Your Honor, we have testimony from several witnesses prepared to confirm that Kincaid's companies coerced or bribed officials to fast-track permits and alter records." A row of people, previously seated quietly, rose in unison: former employees, local residents, and community leaders. Farnsworth attempted to contain the fallout, but it was too late. Each witness, one after another, delivered a damning account of how Kincaid's empire operated. They spoke of intimidation, threats, and forgery. The final blow came from a city official who admitted to signing documents under duress, providing Kincaid with false authority over public land. Judge Romero's gaze swept the room, stopping on Farnsworth. Based on this evidence, it appears the prosecution's case is built on a fundamental falsehood that the property under Willow Creek Bridge belongs to Mr. Kincaid. Without legitimate ownership, the trespassing charge against Mr. Marshall is baseless. I am dismissing all charges against David Marshall, effective immediately. A surge of emotion rose in David's chest, tears welling in his eyes. He felt a hand on his shoulder, Amanda's silent gesture of support. Delaney let out a breath of relief, a small smile forming on his lips. But Judge Romero wasn't finished. She turned back to Farnsworth and Kincaid, her expression stern. "Furthermore, in light of the documents and testimony, this court will recommend a formal investigation into Roger Kincaid's business dealings. If the allegations of fraud and intimidation are substantiated, there could be serious legal consequences." The courtroom exploded in noise. Some people cheered and clapped, while others shouted questions. Kincaid's lawyers tried to hustle him out, but reporters closed in. Cameras flashed as he struggled to keep his composure. He could be seen muttering angrily into a cell phone, likely calling in whatever favors he had left. David, surrounded by a media scrum, felt overwhelmed. Microphones were shoved into his face, reporters peppering him with questions about his reaction to the dismissal and his thoughts on Kincaid's alleged crimes. Through the chaos, he managed to say, "All I ever wanted was a safe place to sleep. I'm grateful that justice was served." Outside the courthouse, Delaney, Amanda, and David found a quieter corner to catch their breath. Sarah Meyer approached, notebook in hand, but her demeanor more subdued. "David, congratulations. This is a huge victory. Do you have any comment for the Gazette?" He looked at her, 1,000 emotions warring in his mind. Finally, he said softly, "Sometimes the truth is all you have. I never expected my fight for a place under a bridge to bring down a real estate mogul. But I hope this sends a message. You can't treat people like disposable objects." Sarah scribbled his quote down, then offered a heartfelt smile. "I'll make sure people hear your story." In the days that followed, Kincaid's downfall accelerated. The City Council launched an internal audit of every permit he'd been granted. State authorities hinted at criminal charges for forgery and fraud. Overnight, the Kincaid brand went from revered to reviled. Investors pulled out, stock prices for his publicly traded ventures plummeted, and even some local politicians who once courted his money publicly denounced him. Karma had arrived with brutal efficiency. The man who once looked down on a homeless veteran now found his entire empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own misdeeds. The final humiliation came when a warrant was issued for Kincaid's arrest on charges of fraudulent land acquisition. He was taken into custody, flashing cameras capturing every moment of his unceremonious exit from a lavish corporate office. Meanwhile, David's life began to shift in a more hopeful direction. Offers of assistance poured in from local charities, businesses, and even individuals who wanted to help him get back on his feet. The Glendale Community Center found him temporary housing, while the DAV worked on a plan to secure his veterans' benefits more efficiently. He was also invited to speak at a town hall meeting about homelessness, an event aimed at raising awareness and empathy. One evening, a week after the charges were dismissed, David stood on a small stage at that town hall, sharing his story with an audience of local residents. He spoke humbly, thanking everyone who had believed in him and urging the community not to ignore the homeless on their streets. "The next homeless person you pass," he said, voice trembling with emotion, "could be a veteran, your neighbor, or someone else who's fallen through the cracks. We're human, and we deserve compassion, not persecution." When he stepped down from the podium, the crowd gave him a standing ovation. In that applause, David heard something he'd thought he'd lost forever: acceptance, dignity, and the promise of a second chance. In the weeks after the courthouse revelations, Glendale underwent a profound reckoning. Kincaid's real estate empire, once considered untouchable, collapsed as authorities uncovered widespread fraud, forging of deeds, and strong arming of officials. Under growing evidence and public scrutiny, he pleaded guilty to multiple charges and was taken into custody, karma coming full circle for the man who once bullied a homeless veteran. The community, meanwhile, rallied for lasting change. Public outrage turned into tangible action. City officials passed new measures to protect public easements and provide better resources for the homeless. Local non-profits expanded outreach, and volunteers, led by Father Rodriguez, converted an abandoned warehouse into a temporary shelter. Amid this wave of transformation, David found a new sense of purpose. Buoyed by the DAV, he received immediate medical care, counseling, and crucial assistance to secure a modest apartment. Offers of employment trickled in, along with invitations to share his experiences at schools and community centers. Though still shaken by his ordeal, David embraced his role as an advocate, encouraging everyone not to overlook those who slip through society's cracks. On a sunny day, he joined neighbors, activists, and city leaders at the reopened Willow Creek Park. The once desolate bridge where he had slept now stood as a symbol of renewal, a space for families and friends to gather, reminding everyone how close despair and hope can be. Standing at a simple podium, David took a deep breath. "This bridge used to be my refuge," he said. "Now it's something more, a reminder that we can choose compassion over neglect." The crowd erupted in applause, many recalling the hardships he had endured and the victory hard won in court. Returning home that evening, David paused by a battered photo of his old army squad. He felt gratitude for the community that had finally heard him, for the justice system that, when pushed, sided with truth, and for the promise of a better tomorrow. His story had begun under a lonely bridge, but now he stood in the light, ready to help others find their way out of the shadows. Sometimes the most dramatic battles aren't fought on faraway battlefields, but right here at home, where justice meets corruption and compassion stands up to greed. David Marshall's journey from a homeless veteran accused of trespassing to a symbol of hope and change proves that one person's courage can inspire an entire community. When powerful individuals abuse their influence, the truth eventually cracks their armor. And when everyday people speak up, real change takes root. Thank you so much for watching and listening to David's story. If his struggle resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps spread the message that every voice matters, every life has value, and it only takes a spark of compassion to illuminate the darkest corners. Stay tuned for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the powerful impact of standing together.